Good afternoon, History Puffs. Welcome to another episode. I'm featuring my friend here, Kyle. Now, Kyle, what goes together better than a good cigar and intelligent conversation?
Freezing your ass off in Russia, featuring La Grande Armée.
Grande Armée. Okay, so the Grande Armée, or Levée en masse under Napoleon, that was revolutionary, right?
Really was.
That was like the first time we saw a draft. So what made that special as opposed to like kings conscripting like all the men from a village? You know what I'm trying to say?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in a sense, at the time, France was so, pardon my French, fucked up. They were in the middle of a revolution, and they were going like, it's funny when you look back at history and you think it's so like dated and stuff, but the more you get into the history, the more you realize they're more like we are today. They're just people. And they were going fucking dummy mode in this shit in the French Revolution. Like, cutting people's heads off in the streets for people they didn't like, on mass scales. Like, I forget, the Terror, I think is what it was called.
The Reign of Terror.
The Reign of Terror, right. And
so they cut off King Louis's
the late
head.
Early 1790s,
something
like that. So they king off King Louis's head, and then anyone who had anything to do with the crown, I guess you could say,
right,
they were just being hunted. Like, certain regions of France were like seeing population loss in terms of percentages, like 10% and shit. It was fucking nuts. It makes like the dissolution of the Ba'ath Party look like, just like nothing, like a Wikipedia article barely worth mentioning. This shit was going hard, so people were actually fucking insane. You talk about radicalism. Ain't no one more fucking radical than, like, a Republicanary Frenchman in the late 1700s. Them motherfuckers were going nuts.
So what happened was they revolted and they beheaded the entire government, right? But then those people who did the beheadings actually got beheaded like 10 years later, right?
Yep.
They just constant. And actually Napoleon, who we're talking about, was famous for firing on protesters during this.
Yep, I think we were just talking about it a second ago. This is in between one of his campaigns, I believe, prior to Russia, after Austerlitz, somewhere in between there, and he had to go back to Paris because people were revolting when he was the emperor, I believe.
Right.
And he decided to use grape shot as one of his crowd dispersion techniques. Like I'm saying, people back then were fucking metal.
For those who are unaware, let's explain grape shot really quick.
Yeah.
It's nasty, all right? This stuff is what made Pickett's Charge a disaster. It's essentially a shotgun, but instead you're shooting like cannonball-sized pellets.
So, for those of you familiar with how shotguns work, you have 20 gauge, right? Pretty small, right? It's almost like opposite direction because 12 gauge is bigger. Like, grape shot would be like 1 gauge, just fucking like size of little mini softballs, but in a cannon, and it's just a shotgun blast. It's like canister shells in tanks today. Yeah,
that's what they call it, didn't they? Canister or something?
Back then, I think they called it grape shot for flavor. But now it's just called canister because, modern and no flavor, unfortunately. But
that's all the flavor, yeah. All right, so let's go back a little bit. So Napoleon is actually the son of French aristocrats, so he has a decent upbringing. He goes to a military academy in France. I forget which one. So he's kind of he has like a noble background. But we're going to start out with the French Revolution. All right, so are you familiar with how it started?
It started because there's, people were really thinking about how the American Revolution went, and France also helped in that. I'm not too familiar with exactly the upbringing, but I know the examples of let them eat cake and shit like that. Basically, French people were fucking pissed at the government because they're treating them like shit. And the Third Estate, which is just basically everyday people, were like, yo, this is some cap. I think the Third Estate was either abolished or something like that, that was like the tinder that ignited this fire, something like that. Maybe you could add on to that.
Well, what I'll say is, remember how you were saying people never change, and that's definitely true. King Louis XIV, he was spending millions upon millions on clothing for his wife, which I can understand that, jewelry, just like all these trinkets and stuff like that. And then the Third Estate, like you were saying, they were starving, right? And they were seeing all this lavish spending. And also the revolution in America put them in a lot of debt too, and they were inspired, so they kind of hopped on the bandwagon. They're like, hey, if they could do it, why can't we do it, right? Well, didn't go so well. Also, it didn't help that there were 2 crop failures, one after the other.
Right.
So there were 2 crop failures, there were famines, and then also King Louis, because he was spending so much on the revolution, but also himself, he raised taxes. So it's like, you have no food, also I'm raising your taxes. They're like, yeah, too much of this. So
Also,
we're not really going to talk about the French Revolution.
Fun fact, though, Queen Marie Antoinette, when she said let them eat cake, she was actually being serious. She was actually trying to be nice, be like, hey, let's give them some cake. Yeah, go, like, protesters.
Wasn't it like there was a
They
lavish
just took
party?
it wrong.
Yeah, no, there was like a lavish party in the Capitol, I think, and then there was so much cake left
give them
over.
some,
She's
yeah.
like, yeah, give them some cake, and then
They took it as, like, go fuck yourself, and they're like, get him!
I know.
Then it turned into WWE WrestleMania and that shit.
So what? Yeah. Man, it's like the French Revolution as a WWE fight. You could probably do that.
Metal. Yeah.
Metal.
That's what I'm saying. Like, this whole period of warfare, like I know far more about other wars and stuff. Like, I like to study. I'm a German major in my college, so I like to study World War II and World War I a lot. But like Napoleon is the most interesting to me in terms of warfare, just because it's like this shit's like an anime. It's so intense, so metal. Like nothing will hit different than being arm by arm with your boys, fighting Russians at 50 meters and the millions.
I know, and
It hits different, you know, a good old bayonet charge and line mass formation, like shit.
let's actually talk about that for a minute. So, it's actually pretty just like hard to imagine that you would stand shoulder to shoulder when there's gunfire going on, right? But that's what they used to do. And the law of history is if something doesn't work, people are going to stop doing it, stop using it, right? But they used that pretty much throughout the whole 18th and 19th century. So why did they do that? Why did they stand shoulder to shoulder?
There's actually a fun tidbit about that. You know, typically when what I found when I learned about history is that there's like a stereotype that's proven wrong. You know, you know, for example, standing in line formations is stupid, it's inefficient, it looks dumb, but then you find out it's wrong, it's actually smart for the time. But then you find out there's also kind of some truth to it in the sense of open rank formations, which did exist at the time. These were proper riflemen with rifled muskets, or rifles, I guess. They're not muskets, because muskets are smoothbore on purpose. But the trade-off of these, and this is why there is both systems. With a musket line infantryman, you can pump off 4 shots a minute, right? Maybe a 15-second reload, right? So you can put down mass fire at short range. The problem is they're smoothbore. And think about it like this, all right? What's more effective? 20 men shooting at the same time, or like 20 men shooting kind of sporadically? You want to formations. You want to mess up formations with those men. It's like a shotgun that fires like 1 pellet every second. It's just not efficient. So that's the point of these line infantrymen, is that they pump off 20 shots at once. They can devastate a line of other infantrymen compared to like sporadically hitting them is just inefficient. However, the open rank infantrymen, otherwise known as like Germans called them Jäger, hunters.
Yeah.
They would be armed with muskets and they could hit people out to like 200 yards. But the problem is it took like a minute for them to reload. Reloading rifles due to the rifling took a lot longer.
Oh, because you would have to like the friction in the bore.
Right.
Wasn't it be hard
I'm not too familiar with how reloading a rifle works compared to a musket. I just know I tried to reload a musket one time. It took me a minute. I would have been a shitty Napoleonic soldier. But it takes a lot longer. So if you were to have like an army of just riflemen, yeah, you could engage at longer distances. But then you would also get your ass kicked once you get within like that 50-meter mark.
Right.
You did see that in the American Revolution a lot, like in Georgia and stuff, in like the Appalachian Mountain Range. You saw a lot of riflemen just because, like, you know, you're shooting from mountains. It's hard to maneuver and stuff in that terrain. So, you know, open rank formations was really easy because you didn't need to push 20 men in a file up a mountain. You know what I mean? You could just like move however you wanted. And you could like plug people at 200 meters and then bail. It's kind of like the freaking Taliban, or not the Taliban.
That's Taliban.
Well, yeah, it's like the Taliban. They used to use Jazales, which were like these old like muskets against the.
Oh, I've seen those before. Yeah.
That's fun fact. Okay, we jumped from Napoleon to the Taliban, but
Yeah, that's good.
they had these Jazale rifles which could hit at like 200 meters, and they would use those against like the British and stuff. They're still using those against the Soviets, that and Lee Enfields, until they picked up, you know, a Soviet
Really?
AK-74.
Wow.
Yeah, they're very traditional weapons. You can still find them in Afghanistan today with these really intricate stocks and woodworking engraved in them. They're super interesting. Definitely look those up when you get a chance. But anyways, that's the difference between line infantrymen and then these open rank people. But the line infantrymen, although, you know, looking back, I thought this at the beginning of, I had a history class about this. It looks so stupid. It looks so inefficient. Why can't they just be open rank? It makes sense now when you think of it in the sense that it's basically a human shotgun.
Right.
And it's easier to coordinate as well when they're in ranks. Coordination was super important this time because it wasn't like today where people are all on radios trying to coordinate stuff and they don't see each other. No, the commander was in the back of the field. Like, it was like fucking squaring off against each other. Like,
didn't they?
Trumpets and flags, as well as runners. Like, there was no technology like that time, so you needed to see what was happening. Like, the enemy commander and the other commander could probably see each other half the damn time if it's like open terrain, which is definitely the biggest fucking square off imaginable. Like, fuck your army, I got my bigger army.
I know.
Baller. It's just intense. It's like an anime.
I mean, that was back in the day when, like, you know, camouflage wasn't a thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, the British had red coats and stuff. You could have, like, your camp in the open. You could have roaring fires, have a big drinking party the night before a battle. You could see the enemy's camp, you know? Because it didn't matter, right? Now it does because of longer range weapons.
You know what the exception to that is, though?
What's that?
The Jaeger.
The Jaeger.
The Jaeger's always traditionally
Those
green.
Germans.
Even in World War II, so the German gray uniform was the standard. The Jaeger
Feldgrau.
wore Feldgrau. Oh no, that was the typical, but the Jaeger wore Feldgrün. The Jaegers always wear green, even in Napoleonic times.
Really? Mm-hmm. Okay. So bringing it back to Napoleon, so in his early days, he capitalizes on the French Revolution because he's like a young captain at some point.
Right.
All right. So he helps the revolutionaries take over the government, right? And then actually, once they're in power, he stages the very first coup d'etat.
Coup d'etat!
Yeah, the very first one. So it's not the first one, but it's the first one to be called a coup. And then he takes over the people who he helped to take over the government. And now he's the unchallenged dictator of France. When you give a mouse a cookie, what does he want? More.
But before that, man, Napoleon's military career, literally, like I said, something out of a drama TV show. I know there's the movie Napoleon and stuff like that. It's so badass. The Battle of Toulon, I believe, which is the port city in France.
Can you talk more about that?
Right. So that was Napoleon's first major victory. He was a captain at the time in the artillery corps. And the artillery has always historically been usually one of the most important branches in the military. The Russians called it the god of war. Us,
really?
That was their name for the artillery branch. Ours is what? The queen of battle?
Yeah, king of battle.
King of battle. Infantry's the queen of battle because
right.
they roll hand in hand. But Napoleon, same thing. Artillery at the time was like the most just powerful branch because they had the most tech and they could inflict the most casualties. Typically at that time, the enemy with the better artillery typically won because line infantry formation because only fire at 50 meters. Artillery could fire for like a mile.
Yeah.
And especially later during like during the Civil War and stuff, you could fire indirect. You know?
Yeah, and with like relative accuracy too. I know the Confederate artillery was notorious for overshooting, right? But I mean, were they relatively more accurate than muskets? Do you think?
What the cannons?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Like they weren't rifled or anything. Actually, I do not know that. I bet some were.
Cannons? I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know. But like you could hit targets up multiple hundreds of yards away, especially with like different rounds that they had. There's a lot of technology that goes into like the cannon at the time, the metallurgy.
Right.
But Napoleon's thing, at least during the Battle of Toulon, is that he managed to do a diversionary attack on kind of this peninsula overlooking the harbor. And I believe the British were in the harbor, and it was just a big slugfest. Because this is at the point of the French Revolution where they're kind of getting their ass kicked. Like, they were at a multinational coalition was, like, invading France with, like, Austrians and British, and Prussians, and they weren't doing so well. This wasn't the Napoleon that we know, because Napoleon wasn't in charge at the time. He was a captain. But he managed to take, I believe it was called Fort Invincible or Fort Fearless or something like that in French.
Fort Invincible. That's what I'm going to call a fort that I've made.
Exactly. That's what the men thought, too. It was some badass name, and so all the men were like, fuck yeah! Like, fuck you, Britain, we're in Fort Invincible. And so, like, really rallied the men. He motivated the shit out of these men to hold their ground, despite, like, the British throwing everything they had at them. But they managed to take it and hold it, and because of that, they put cannons on this peninsula that overlooked the harbor.
Oh, boy. All right.
Going down. Fort Invincible is going down.
All right.
It's a little windy out here today.
Yeah, a little windy out here. No, keep on talking.
Anyways, this is his first big victory. So, and this is one of the first really big victories of the French Revolution too. Napoleon, as a captain, managed to take this peninsula that overlooked the harbor, and the British had to evacuate from Toulon, which allowed the French to retake Toulon, which is one of their big cities. And this got him promoted, I shit you not, one of, I think, the biggest promotion in modern military history, from captain to major general. That is a baller-ass maneuver. Like, that shit is like, you can't make that, you would never see that today. That's why I love this period of history, just because everything's so fucking dramatic.
Right.
And at the time in the French army, too, you had rampant, not corruption, but just cronyism, right?
Well, it's
like, if you were the
shambles,
son,
right? There's a revolution going on.
Well, if you were the son of a nobleman at the time, even in the military, if you were the son of a nobleman, like, you had teenagers being colonels and shit like that.
Oh, yeah.
It just was wrong. And the soldiers, the army, who was like enlisted and stuff at the time for this, would just like look at them as jokes. They wanted a meritocracy, and Napoleon gave them that. So he became major general, and then he began to go through his campaigns, like the Italian campaign and shit.
Let me go ahead and add on to that. One of the reasons why Napoleon, he was also just an inspirational guy. Like, you would want to serve under him.
Was,
very
so
charismatic. One of the reasons why is actually he had a super ability to remember people's names. So even when he was a general, he could run up to like Joe Blow Private on the front and be like, "Hey, John, right? Go take that cannon or whatever." You know, he would remember your name basically forever. So that's why people were just following him into the cold of Russia and into Egypt and Italy and everywhere, you know. So that was one. I mean, he was also just a great commander, so they had faith in him that way. But that's definitely a good thing of leadership, you know. Good leadership trait. So, anyways, moving on. So Napoleon's early days, right, gets promoted to what?
Major general.
Major general.
Baller.
From captain. How many steps is that? Like 5?
Fucking 5, and he's still like 23 at the time or something like that. Dude, oh my god, it's so
Dude was
badass.
young as hell.
Yeah.
He was only, I mean, when he died, he was only what, like 35?
Yeah, something like that. When he went to Ascension Island.
Yeah.
It's called Ascension.
Right. Also,
by the way, it was used by the British to launch bomber raids against the Falkland Islands.
So fun
Bingo.
fact, so I'm full of fun facts and this guy's full of actual history. But again,
no, it's good. We work together.
You know that Napoleon is a hero because during the French Revolution he got wounded in the right thigh. Because you know in movies like the heroes always get wounded in the right thigh. You know that's how you know he's a hero.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways,
typical movie trope.
But so after the revolution, right, he achieves relative stability by taking over France. All right, like I said, you give him mouse a cookie, he wants some milk. He goes out and takes Italy.
You want the cake.
You want the cake. You want the cake. All right. And artillery really came into fruition in his Italian campaign. Like, he really started nailing it down because now he's a general, so he has command over all that stuff. All right? So, yeah.
What? I don't remember the Italian campaign too much. I kind of winged this from my history class that I took like a year ago. But I do know that he was able to divide and conquer the enemy in the Italian campaign. He was able to outmaneuver the Italians because they were like set up into 3 different camps or something like that. He basically managed to like rout one and then rout the other and then the third, and they took all of Italy essentially.
Okay, so how was he able to maneuver so much better than his enemies? Because they all have the same equipment.
They do. Well, yeah, pretty
I mean,
much.
like generally speaking, you know.
You know, all the basics of warfare at the time were held by all the armies. They had artillery, line infantrymen, etc. Napoleon was the master of maneuver. He really was, especially early in his campaigns, which is why later in his later campaigns it became difficult because he lost his key cavalry units, which was like the spearhead of his maneuver warfare. So here's how Napoleon was able to be so damn maneuverable. He was the first leader in any army at the time to invent the corps system. And the corps system is really cool because the corps system meant that you were rolling in smaller armies, and these smaller armies were much more maneuverable than the larger mass armies of, say, the Austrians or the Russians at the time or something like that.
So is that why modern armies have French terminology like corps and like sergeant, lieutenant, right? Those are all French words.
That's true. That's true. I'm unsure on whether those derive from there, but it would make sense because what happened is that all of the Allied armies, which is just the name for the Prussians, the Austrians, because they were all coalescing against Napoleon.
It was everyone against France.
They copied
right?
the French system, yes.
Yeah.
They eventually copied the French system of corps and maneuver later on, and were able, I would make sense, for like sergeant, corps, lieutenant, etc.
Yeah.
But also Napoleon was able to, through technology, the French had artillery systems that could be towed by horse. Really quickly. So they're like called like horse artillery or something like that, or flying artillery. I'm not
creative
exactly
name,
sure.
horse artillery.
Yeah, exactly. But what this meant is that the artillery could keep up with the cavalry, which was huge. That means that whoever brought, basically, it's kind of like the idea of tanks today, right? He with tanks wins battle. If you have a tank beats no tank. It's like
Tank beats no
artillery.
tank.
That's like artillery at the time. He with artillery pretty much beats he without artillery. And so if your cavalry is able to outmaneuver the enemy and get in positions where they're not prepared to defend, if you can bring artillery to that, which Napoleon was able to do, and be able to reinforce that with more horses and more supply lines, that is how you win battles. And you see that at Austerlitz.
No kidding.
You see that at the Prussian campaign. I forget the name of the city.
We'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that. But yeah.
Austerlitz, we're gonna get into that too. But real quick, fun
We
fact from his.
We just had a conversation about this, Kevin.
Hey, fun
sorry.
fact from his. Yeah, we got our friends over there. Fun fact from his Egyptian campaign. Then we're going to get to the European campaign. But Napoleon was actually the one who brought weed or marijuana to European nations. Because what he did is he went to Egypt,
yeah.
and at the time Egypt was a Muslim country, and there was no alcohol allowed. So everyone smoked hash, or they ate hash.
Ganja.
All right, and so they actually brought it back to Europe, and they used it for its medicinal properties. Sure, yeah. Anyway, so then what they did was they signed the Treaty of Amiens, which ended the conflict in France, and then they went to Prussia. All right, and now let's go ahead and talk about Austerlitz. So this is Napoleon's masterpiece.
This
right?
is against the Austrians, correct?
Yes.
So the Austrians and the French always had a bone to pick with each other because the Austrians just got done invading France for a little bit, and so the French were like, "Okay, motherfuckers, our time to shine." So there was another battle. So Austerlitz was the first, and frankly, fine. There was another battle after Austerlitz, I believe, in Vienna. But Austerlitz, we can both talk about this because you prepped on this too. Was just a great example of the new corps system, the new towed artillery system, the training of the French army at the time, and they just basically were able to school. And the Austrians really resembled the old style of warfare, right? Much more, build your armies up as a king, conscription.
Okay.
And not
Yeah,
non-conscription,
nobility
actually.
as officers and that kind
Nobility
of
as
stuff.
officers rather than meritocracy.
Okay.
And Napoleon was just able to school them, essentially. What happened is that, again, you have Napoleon's main force was able to scout out where the Austrians are at and then pick their favorable terrain. And that the Austrians basically moved Napoleon in a way that gave Napoleon the high ground, but they didn't realize.
So he actually
then
weakened
Napoleon
his right flank. So
on
they would
purpose.
deliberately charge up that hill.
And that's actually a tip from Frederick the Great. It's called unbalanced warfare or something like that. Basically, where like you weaken one flank, so you strengthen the other, and then you just basically like yin yang circle around them and shit. That's basically what Napoleon did here in Austerlitz, and was able to basically trap the entire Austrian army, pin their back against not the Spray.
It was some river somewhere, right?
Yeah, and basically pushed them into the river and destroyed basically the entire Austrian army. They destroyed them so bad, the Russians under Kutuzov just said bye, and they just left. They were like, yeah, you're fucked.
Yeah. So, quick question I have for you is, Napoleon was conscripting from peasants. All right, these guys were used to farming and not doing anything like that. Levée en masse, like we were saying. How was he able to train them to be better than the professional armies of Austria at the time?
Well, part of it is also national pride. Like, think about it. This is the French Revolution at the time. The French knew that if they were to lose against the Austrians or under the British, then they would return back to the old imperial system of like the French king taking power, and they'd be back to being dirt poor as shit.
Right.
Their lives would get significantly worse if they lost this. So they're almost like on Sun Tzu would say, on death's ground. Either they lose, and they die if they lose, like either in battle, or they would rather just die than live back in France.
Dude,
or
you're
they
just
win.
full of these good analogies.
I love this shit.
I'm telling you.
I can't believe they found Sun Tzu in this shit.
I know.
Sun Tzu, that was one of his principles, death's ground. If you put your soldiers on death's ground, then they will fight until the very end.
Yeah.
Because they have no alternative. And that's how the French soldiers thought at the time. They were people fighting in La Grande Armée were extremely patriotic. Like, they knew, like I said, the consequences if they lost, and they were going to, like, people were, although conscription did occur, people were signing up in mass because they wanted to fucking win.
Well, this is the first
Very hungry army.
Oh, yeah, but this is the first instance of nationalism in history. Because before this, you have kings leading conquests to fight their brother or whatever because they were angry at them. But now it's
national.
people fighting for France. They're not fighting for their king, they're fighting for France.
That's actually a very good point, because that is a lot different than fighting for a king or fighting for a crown, for example. Because they were fighting for themselves. And that is something that you see...
That's motivational.
That's something you see much later in history for other countries. Like this whole national sentiment. That's a very World War I-esque kind of thing. Like, but you see that here with Napoleon very early on. So he's able to conscript this army. He was able to train them very well. And then he also had his marshals. His marshals were also the cream of the crop. That was also a new system he implemented as well. Other armies did not have the marshal system because you needed the marshal system to have the corps system. Because a marshal would be in charge. So a marshal would be in charge of a corps, and instead of it's almost the German system of Auftragstaktik.
Oh, mission command. So,
mission command. And go ahead. You know that too.
Yeah.
You know that too.
So mission command, and it's funny because the U.S. Army actually uses this, and they don't even try to hide it. In the actual U.S. Army pamphlets, you'll see, this is from the German Army. And what it is giving command to the lowest level possible, because that's the guy on the ground. So you're like, hey, this is what I want to happen. You figure it out, okay? Do this however you want to do it, but you have control. This is what I want done.
Basically, the difference is that, typically when you'd expect military, it's very structured in terms of like orders and stuff like that. You'd be like, all right, take this bridge. You're going to have this disposal under you. It has to be at this specific time, and I'm going to coordinate it for you, essentially, is how the old system... And it still works to this day. This is very common in military doctrine in many countries today. Auftragstaktik tells you, you have to take this bridge, you do it how you see fit.
Yeah.
Just do it by, like, this time or something.
That's
like
thing.
Very minimal instructions that gives the commander in charge of taking said bridge, for example, as much operational maneuver as possible. If you give him more options, he can do it the best way he sees fit, and that will often lead to victory. And it also is speed. He doesn't have to wait on anything. He doesn't have to, follow on coordinating instructions. It's a way that basically says, hey, take this bridge, take it now, for example, and then that commander can move on that as soon as possible. Oftentimes, in battles, I forget who said this. It was a Russian general during the Napoleonic Wars. Russian theories on warfare are super intricate, too. I love studying this shit. Minutes often decide battles, hours often decide wars, and days often decide entire fates of countries. Yeah.
So one thing I want to add, and that's actually a really good quote. That's cool stuff. So with Auftragstaktik, or this mission command, one key difference is soldiers were often encouraged to disobey orders from higher if they saw it fit to accomplish the mission.
Right.
So anyways, moving on from mission command.
Mind if I just touch on that for a second?
Go ahead.
So that ties back to the marshal system in the sense that these marshals who are super trained and know very well, Napoleon could give them the authority to do what they wanted to do. If Napoleon told Berthier, hey, I want you to swing around this flank, as long as Napoleon gave Berthier an intent, all right, so basically here's what's happening, Berthier. You have the Prussian army here. I want you to sandwich them. Berthier here's sandwich them, and he's going to do that to the best of his ability, how he sees fit. Napoleon doesn't need to micromanage that much because he trusts his marshals in order to execute his orders. And that's another thing that happens later on. Again, fucking metal warfare. In World War II, for example, which I love World War II, but I like Napoleonic talking about more because it's more interesting, it's more metal. In World War II, you never see a general... Well, you sometimes did, but it's very rare for generals to get killed in the field, right?
Right.
You'd see this maybe in surprise blitzkrieg attacks like Battle of the Bulge. You saw a couple of U.S. generals get killed, or when an army surrenders like Paulus and Stalingrad. But Napoleon, this shit was very common. By the end of Napoleon's military career, it became very hard for him to keep up his system because he no longer had the cavalry to maneuver because they all died. He no longer had the professional army to lead his victories because they all died. And he no longer had his marshals who he trusted and who were seasoned veterans of previous campaigns to lead those armies because they fucking died.
Oh, wow.
They all got killed in combat or in probably Russia, starved to death or froze to death.
So that's what happens next, right? So moving on from, he steamrolls through Austria, right? Mm-hmm. And then he goes to Russia. Mm-hmm. All right, and Russia is, no one has ever had a good time in Russia trying to take it, all right?
Russia is.
So from what I understand, the Russians hardly fought Napoleon at all. They're like, hey, this guy's good, we can't beat him. So they used what was called scorched earth tactics. And what that is they would retreat and they would burn all their food, ammunition, supplies, and everything, so the invading army would starve, right? And they would go deeper and deeper and deeper, and then they found themselves in Russia in the winter, and they froze. But he actually made it to Moscow, though. That's something the Germans in World War II couldn't even do.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about Russia, too, is that the Russian army, in typical Russian fashion, was fucking massive, as always. But they still followed the old system. Russia did have some very skilled commanders, though, like Kutuzov. Kutuzov was a very skilled Russian commander at the time that knew Napoleon not personally, but knew his style and tried to combat it as best as he could. So there were big battles in Russia that costed millions of French lives. It's kind of the same kind of trope that you see in World War II, like, oh, the Wehrmacht was able to steam through Russia in 1941, but the Wehrmacht still lost 1 million men. There were big battles happening all the time.
Right.
Same thing with the French campaign in 1812. So France was going into Russia with the largest army the Grande Armée has ever seen, a multinational coalition of French, Prussians, because he defeated Prussia, was able to recruit from the different regions of Germany at the time. He was also able to recruit the Austrians, because the Austrians also lost. So they had Austrians on his side, but they weren't very loyal. They just kind of did what he told them to do. It's like what you see in World War II with the Germans.
Yeah.
With the Osttruppen or so. Or so. Sorry, I just language switched right there.
German major
Polish,
over here, Kyle.
basically Polish troops fighting on the Western Front against the Allies. Another interesting thing, definitely look up. But the biggest army that the Grande Armée has ever seen, but it wasn't as skilled as his earlier ones. It was bigger, but less efficient. But you still see massive fucking battles like Smolensk and Borodinayo, I think.
I know about Smolensk. I don't know about that one.
Borodinayo was the biggest battle outside of Leipzig
Okay.
of the Napoleonic Wars.
Just like in terms of men.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's awesome paintings of this too, of like Kutuzov praying to like the Christian Orthodoxy high priest of Russia right before the battle, and the entire Russian army on a knee and shit. It's super badass.
I'll put that up on the screen there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But anyways, so you see these massive battles, and the Grand Army is gradually getting worn down through these battles. And then the Russians realize, you're right, they're going to take Moscow, let's burn everything down. The Russians know, here's what Russians always know in their wars, is that they have land to spare and they have men to spare. That's something that they always have going for their side. So they decide, you know what, let's give up our land. Their supply line goes back to Paris. Our supply line can go back as far as we want it to.
So did they burn down Moscow, or did Napoleon burn down Moscow?
They ransacked, the Russians ransacked Moscow, evacuated it, made sure there's nothing there for Napoleon and his men to take in terms of food and stocks and stuff. Because that's how warfare worked at this time too. There was no like military industrial complex that would make MREs or whatever and ship those up to the line from Washington D.C. or whatever.
Right.
At the time, no. If you were the cavalry, if you were the Cossacks, for example, you would literally just like ram into a village, steal all the food they had, and continue onwards. Drive on.
And they knew that, and they're like, if there's no food, then they can't eat, and if there's no bullets, they can't shoot, right?
Exactly.
So that's what they did. So anyways, Russia goes horribly for Napoleon, all right? And after that, that's sort of his high tide. And then after that, you see... not like he won a lot of battles after that, but we're gonna get to the famous one, which is Waterloo. Yeah, Waterloo.
So the 100 Days campaign.
So how did we get to Waterloo is what I'm curious about.
So Russia ended horribly. The Grand Army had to retreat all across Russia. They lost somewhere like a third of their entire army due to starvation, hunger, and they were already dying of starvation and hunger during the Russian campaign itself. The Pripyat marshes and also the massive steppes of Russia, people are getting disease like crazy. But now it was exacerbated because of winter. And they were not prepared for that at all. They didn't have the shelter that they needed to carry a Grand Army. The horses didn't have the grass they needed to eat, so the horses began dying. Napoleon lost his cavalry. He basically lost, I think he only had a third of his army left by the time he got back away from Russia. And by that point, all of the Allied armies knew he was weak and just kept pressing him back to Paris, essentially.
Okay.
Napoleon did manage, however, this is why Napoleon's a genius. Despite all this, he still managed to hold Paris. And because he led a really skilled rearguard campaign after the Russian campaign with this ragtag army that he had left. The Prussians had turned sides. They'd basically what's it called?
They pulled in Italy and they switched sides.
They switched sides. The Austrians also switched sides, and so Napoleon needed to quickly raise an army and defend Paris, which he did. Unfortunately, after that, he was forced to surrender. But he just didn't want to lose Paris because that's where all the standards were. That's another thing too. You capture an enemy standard at the time, which is like their flag bearer.
Their flag, yeah.
That's a big deal. That's like victory. They did that at Austerlitz, and they were just big flex.
So the most Medal of Honors in the American Civil War were given out for capturing the enemy standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a big deal at the time.
So you're saying that they push him back to Paris, and is that where Waterloo happens in France?
So what happens there is that France, the Allies say, you know what, fuck you, Napoleon. they lead a new campaign. They try to take Paris. They fail, but then again, Napoleon basically has to surrender because he has no ability or means to lead a long campaign like this. They banish him to Ascension Island. No. That's the second island. They banish him to some island in the Mediterranean. I forget the name of it. But then he comes back.
So they exile him,
back.
and then he comes back.
He does,
and then he's still. Really?
So they're under the Imperial Army at the time. The Imperial Army is under charge. Napoleon comes back, gets a lot of his loyal followers in the south of France with him. They start going up to Paris to retake Paris.
Are a lot of these followers Moscow veterans?
I'm unsure about that. I would imagine so. Remind you, like, significant portions, they were running out of French men to recruit. They were all dead.
This guy must be one of the most motivational people in history.
This is in the movie Napoleon, too, really well portrayed. But Napoleon is basically, there's a moment, at least in the movie and in real life, I forget in which town, where, like, the army is coming to capture him, the French army, and, like, arrest him or kill him, essentially. And he basically tells them, like, do it for France. He basically turns the army that is supposed to kill him on his side.
What?
And then they go into Paris, retake Paris, gets an army together, and then starts the 100 Days campaign.
Wow.
And the 100 Days campaign...
This guy's a real badass.
I totally forgot. This is where it's kind of hazy from my class, but there was also the Battle of Leipzig and the Battle of Cologne.
And these happened after he was exiled the first time.
This happened prior to exile. My bad. This is like after he failed. This is like after he failed in Russia and he's defending. Leipzig is where shit really gets bad for Napoleon, because basically what happens in Leipzig is you have a river again, a fucking river, Napoleon's greatest enemy, in the town of Leipzig, and he's trying to defend. The Allies created a new doctrine at the time, which is basically don't fight Napoleon directly or else you will lose. This happened at Cologne. No, Cologne.
But they called it that too.
Mm-hmm. This happened at Cologne, and then Napoleon won. Napoleon was still winning battles. He just couldn't win operational battles. Here's the thing, too. There's a difference between tactical, operational, and strategic level warfare. You know, operational type of warfare is like being able to destroy an entire army in the field and win the war. Because operationally, that's like winning a war. Strategic is like the means of like the goals of a country. Tactical is like battle here and there.
Like guy on the ground is tactical, yeah. But anyway, so the 100 Days campaign, does that end with Waterloo?
It ends with Waterloo.
Okay.
And that's why all of Napoleon, the rest of the marshals that are still alive, die. You know, and we haven't even talked about the Peninsula campaign, which
I actually don't know a whole lot about that.
My favorite general of Napoleonic Wars is from the Peninsula campaign. Major General Moore of the British side. He dies an epic fucking death saving the British army at Corona?
What does he do?
Basically what happens is the British, this is their specialty, sea evacuations. They pulled Dunkirk, 1808, basically. And the British army were getting their ass kicked in the Peninsula campaign. One of Napoleon's marshals is routing him to a port town of Corona, I believe.
That's a sensitive word these days.
It really is, Jesus. But anyways, what Major General Moore basically is able to do is pull a 300 with his outnumbered force, defend long enough for the British Navy to arrive. When the British Navy told them, yeah, we're not going to get there in time, it's impossible. Stopped the French army for long enough for the British army to get on the boats and evacuate, like overnight essentially. Like this was a multi-day battle, but overnight get on the boats, get the fuck out kind of thing.
Wow.
Saved the British Expeditionary Force, kind of like 1940. But Major General Moore is shot by a cannon during the battle, and he's like, I forget his dying quote, it's like, do it for the men or something like that. He has like a fucking cannonball in his chest. Favorite character, most metal fucking character. He got the Victoria... Oh, no, that didn't exist at the time, actually.
Right.
But he got Britain's highest, basically, military award for it.
Okay.
But yeah, anyway, so that happens. Battle of Leipzig happens. Battle of Leipzig was the last major defeat before the 100 Days campaign. That's what causes him to get exiled, essentially.
Okay.
Loses at Leipzig because he tells a captain, or he tells like a colonel or something. This is the dissemination of commands, essentially. Okay, don't blow this bridge until the army's across. Colonel tells a colonel tells a lieutenant colonel tells a major, tells a captain, tells a lieutenant, tells a sergeant, tells a private, essentially, but it gets muddled on the way. And so
whisper down the lane.
The private hears, as soon as you see Russians, blow the bridge.
Oh no.
And so Napoleon's still on the other side, and then he sees Russians are firing at him, from the other side of the bridge. So the private just blows the fucking bridge. And then that leaves Napoleon and his army on the other side still, because they were still fighting in Leipzig. So because of that, Napoleon couldn't retreat. He was surrounded. He had to surrender. And because he surrendered at Leipzig, they banished him. And then he came back for the 100 Days campaign.
Okay.
Rallied his army because he's such a charismatic motherfucker. He is badass as hell.
Badass.
Then starts the 100 Days campaign.
And
Ends
then we
at
get
Waterloo.
to Waterloo. Okay, so let's talk about Waterloo. So we've got the Duke of Wellington, all right? We've got the Prussians, who
Fifth
they
Corps.
take all the credit, but it was really the Duke of Wellington who was taking all the bullets and everything for the battle. But yeah, so this is his great defeat, right? So I actually don't know a whole lot about what actually happened at Waterloo. I know there was like a building in the center that was pretty decisive in the battle.
Right.
But why don't you talk about Waterloo?
Waterloo, I'm not too familiar with it because it really, in this grand scheme of things, was a really small battle. When you talk about the numbers of all the Napoleonic wars, it's really one of the smallest. When you think of like Borodino, that's the name of the Russian town. Borodino is one of the biggest battles, I think, outside of Leipzig, of the entire Napoleonic wars. But it's basically like million versus a million men. Like Waterloo was like a couple thousand. You know, it was pretty small, but it's so symbolic because you see Duke of Wellington's corps.
Who's British, by the way. Yeah.
Who's British,
Yeah.
hold his ground against the Revolutionary Guard, the Republican, or not the Republican Guard.
That's Iraq.
The Imperial Guard of Napoleon. And the Imperial Guard of Napoleon is like Napoleon's bodyguard. They were the cream of the crop. They were like really the best troops in Napoleon's army. And Duke of Wellington is able to blunt the Imperial Guard, which must have just been a heartbreak to Napoleon because he like knew a lot of these guys. Napoleon rarely dedicated the Imperial Guard into a battle unless it was like essential. So this is one of the few times they were dedicated in, even though they were the best troops. It's kind of like the Panzerlehr of World War II, the British or the German tank school. The people who run the German tank school, they got put into a division, sent to the Western Front, and basically got bombed to shit by American air power. Or the Infanterielehre, the infantry school runners, who got sent to
Russia?
Anzio? No, they got sent to...
That's Italy.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Because there was Anzio beach landing, and then there's also Salerno. Yeah, Anzio, they basically all got wiped due to American artillery. Basically, here with Napoleon and his Imperial Guard, they just got wiped out by the British because they were in these deep entrenched lines and it got hit by artillery. Meanwhile, Blucher is doing his whole thing in Fifth Corps. But anyways, yeah,
takes all
losing
the
the Imperial Guard, he really didn't have anything left after that. Napoleon was really running on strings. He had basically no marshals left. He had basically no heavy cavalry left.
And this is like the first time the Imperial Guard was decisively defeated, which is like just a huge morale blow. It's like let me draw another comparison. I don't know, maybe let me think. Some like Peyton Manning, I don't know, what if he loses that first pass in a game or something? Like, that's a terrible analogy. I don't even watch football.
Like Tom Brady, if he throws a pick six at the most important moment of the game. Or
doesn't make it, right? So very symbolic defeat.
Or like you dedicate all the Green Berets to a battle and they get wiped out by a bunch of Vietnamese like sappers and
that's a good one. Yeah, this is why I have you on the show. All right, so before we wrap up here, we didn't talk about this yet. So Kyle, what are you smoking?
That's a good question, actually. I don't even know.
It's just
Hickory Smokes.
It's actually factory smokes. Yeah. We're both smoking
good shit.
Drew Estate Factory Smoked Maduro. I've said this before.
Very earthy.
These are like very earthy, chocolatey. I call them like the perfect Maduros. So if you're trying to get someone into cigars,
good with
and
mochas.
You want to, good with mochas. No, coffee is just like the best thing in the world to have with cigars. But
very true.
Yeah. Anyways, and whenever I want to get someone into cigars, the first thing I ask them is, how do you take your coffee? Because if they take it with cream and sugar, give them a Connecticut. If they take it dark, give them a Maduro like here. And this is how you introduce people to the darker cigars, the stronger ones. So, anyways, so Waterloo is over. All right. So after Waterloo, Britain has unchallenged naval supremacy for the next pretty much ever until World War II.
100 years.
Yeah, 100 years, until they lose all their colonies in the 1950s. What else happens after Napoleon?
So Napoleon gets banished to Ascension Island, and that's where he lives out the rest of his days. He has a house there. He lives a decent life, but then he dies, I think, of like cancer or something like that, or ulcers or some shit.
Yeah.
Nothing really happens. France remains under the Imperial king for another 80 years or something like that.
And they have more revolutions after this too. Like Les Miserables actually takes place in 1820, so that's after Napoleon.
Then you have the Prussian-French Wars, which I believe is over the same thing. Like they wanted a republican system again, and so Prussia just said nah in the 1870s, and then took over Alsace-Lorraine, which foreshadowing is important later. Foreshadow. Yeah, basically like Napoleon really was a national idol to France. I don't know how he's appeared in France today, because you have all these national leaders in other countries like Stalin in Russia. Very, very controversial. You know, you either have people that love Stalin or hate him because he's a maniac. Mao Zedong in China.
Well, Mao Zedong, I'll talk about him later.
Widely, frankly, loved in China, but not loved everywhere else because, frankly, he's a maniac. But Napoleon is kind of loved in France because he was really the symbol head of the French Republic. He hated the crown. He wanted the French people to live under like a republican system, even though he was a dictator, which is ironic.
Yeah.
But he was that symbol to France, and such a competent leader too. He really is like a right place, right time, historical genius, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like no one could match him in terms of military ability. The Allies knew that and said, no, don't fight Napoleon with their new strategy in 1814. Don't fight him directly, or else you will lose. He was that good, even with his defeated, decrepit, crippled army. So
that is one of the most motivational things.
Like coolest, interesting characters in history. And he wasn't even French. He was he was from
really
some island off of France. He was not a French. He kind of was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Wow, we could talk all day about Napoleon, but it's getting to be that time, folks. So, anyways, Kyle, hey, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. Like, you taught me some things I wasn't even aware of.
Thank you for inviting me. I love being on the show.
Happy to have you. Like I said, we're not historians. We just like to talk about history, and we love
just some
cigars.
dudes.
We just some dudes. All right, so fellow history lovers and cigar aficionados out there, keep on buffing and keep on puffing.